Firstly, I have to say I'm very glad to be here and to have this opportunity to share with all of you some ideas, a part of the ideas which I have been working on since the beginning, the end of 80s and the beginning of 90s. And I have to say thanks to the Department of Sociology and Equity Studies in Education for that opportunity, and to say thanks to the Center for Studies in Work and Education. And I prepared a presentation about schooling and the dialectical reproduction of knowledge from the perspective of activity theory. It was not easy to prepare that presentation because I have had to select some ideas, to collect some ideas, and I will present here just some parts of the theory that I have been working on for some years. Well, I will start with a question. Which would be the main tasks of a Marxist pedagogy concerning to schooling? Because I have been working on a Marxist theory of education, on a Marxist pedagogy, and it's important to answer this question. This question was answered by a Brazilian educator in this way. The first task would be the identification of the most developed forms by which objective and historically produced knowledge is expressed, recognizing the condition of its production and understanding its main manifestations, as well as the present tendencies of its transformation. The second task, conversion of the objective knowledge into school knowledge in such a way as to make possible its appropriation by students inside school space and time. And the third task, providing the necessary means for the students not only to appropriate objective knowledge as a result, but also to appropriate the process of its production, as well as the tendencies of its transformation. I agree with that answer formulated by Dermeval Saviani, emeritus professor of Unicamp, a Brazilian university, Universidade Estadual de Campinas. Professor Saviani has become, since the 70s, an important reference in Brazil as well as in the rest of South America for educators who have been working for the construction of Marxist pedagogy. Saviani also formulated the following definition of the educational work at school. The educational work is to produce intentionally and directly in each individual the humanity which has been produced historically and collectively by the humankind. In this sense, the object of education is related, on one hand, to the identification of the cultural contents that have been appropriated by the human individuals who are in process of formation or humanization, and on the other hand, and at the same time, to the discovering of the most adequate forms to achieve that goal. Well, I can say, if the school education is the production on the individuals of the human characteristics produced during the human social history, then we can say that school education is a process of reproduction in a positive meaning. Well, the fundamental ideas of activity theory can help us to understand dialectically this positive meaning of school education as reproduction of the historical experience. As maybe you know, the three most important references for active theory in the field of psychology are Lev Semenovich Vygotsky, Alexander Romanovich Luria, and Alexei Nikolaevich Leontyev. There are other authors in that school of Marxist psychology, as Elkonin, Davidov, Zaporozhets, and so, who worked together with Vygotsky, Luria, Leontyev, and there are many contemporary authors who have been working in the perspective of activity theory. Well, how activity theory can help us to understand that idea of school education as a dialectical reproduction of the human characteristics, of the human culture, the human experience, the human knowledge. In my interpretation, in my opinion, the start point of activity theory is that the human being, the conception of the human being as an essentially social and historical being. The difference between human activity and animal activity. That start point is rooted in the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. For Marx and Engels, labor is the specifically human vital activity. Labor is the metabolism between the human beings and the nature. The existence of humankind is impossible without that active relation between human beings and the nature. The fundamental social process is the production of the means of satisfaction of human necessities. I have to emphasize that the fundamental social process is not just the direct satisfaction of human necessities, but it is the production of the means of that satisfaction. That means that it's a mediated process. That production is a process of transformation of nature. The other animal species survive by an active adaptation to the natural environment. The humankind transforms the environment, creating the social, cultural, historical world, creating the human world. That is a historical process of production and reproduction of the material and non-material cultural reality. A cultural object is a product of human activity, even when human beings just make some very little changing in the form of a natural object in order to use it with some practical proposals. In its most simple forms, labor is no more than that. Human beings change the physical form of a natural object, for example, a stone, a bone, etc., and after that use it as a tool. A tool is a creation of human beings. It is not just a result of natural process. Even when human beings create a new function, a social function, for a natural object, that process transforms that object in something social, cultural, something humanized. The labor, human labor, humanizes the nature. There is here a quotation from Leontyev, from one of the books of Leontyev. The title of that book is Problems of Development of Mind. In that book, Leontyev wrote that labor, by realizing the production process in both its forms, material and spiritual, is imprinted in its product. The conversion of labor from a form activity into a form of being or objectivity can be regarded from different aspects and in different contexts. It can be considered from the angle of the amount of labor power expended and in relation to the quantity of output produced, abstracting it from the concrete content of the labor. The process can, however, be considered from the aspect of the content of the labor activity itself, in its relation to the producing individuals, abstracting it from its other aspects and relations. The transformation then appears to us as a process of the embodiment, objectification of human beings' spiritual forces in the products of their activity, while the history of mankind's material and spiritual culture appears as a process that expresses in its outward objective form the advances in the development of the human species' abilities. During the social history, the totality of human activity has been creating many different kinds of material and non-material systems or structures of cultural objects. They are a Marx expression, they are the essential powers of humankind, or social organs, the inorganic body of humankind. Just I have to explain quickly that word, the meaning of word here, objectification, because in the common sense, normally objectification means a negative process by which we consider people as objects, or a kind of alienated process similar to the fetishism, similar to the commodification, but in this context, in Marx works, the meaning of that concept of objectification is different. I can say it is a positive meaning. It is that process by which the human activity became a material result, material and non-material, but an objective result. For example, language. Language has been produced by human beings, by human activity, and we can consider language as a result of the process, the objectification of the communication process in the thought of human beings. Well, but now we have another question. How those essential powers of humankind are transmitted to each human individual? The answer of activity theory is by the appropriation of the social experience accumulated, embodied, objectified in the material and non-material cultural objects. The individual's formation process is a result of appropriation of the inorganic body of humankind. Leontyev was among the authors in the field of activity theory, the one that, in my opinion, worked and developed better the meaning of appropriation. Leontyev developed a very good analysis of the process, the appropriation of cultural products, cultural objects, cultural systems by the individuals in the process of the individual's formation. Let's speak a little about the concept of appropriation in the works of Leontyev. The totality of social objectified, embodied, accumulated human powers is a synthesis of the human social and historical experience. Each cultural object is, in itself, condensed human activity. This activity is embodied in that object. A human individual can insert that object in her own activity only if she appropriates the activity embodied in it, in the cultural object, mainly the correct use of that cultural object, but sometimes also its production activity. The process of appropriation is valid for all kinds of cultural objects, material and non-material. Leontyev, in that book, The Problems of Development of Mind, explains the difference between the biological process of adaptation and the social process of appropriation. And that difference is so important because for most of psychological theories, the development of the human individuals is a process of adaptation. And Leontyev disagrees with that idea. For Leontyev, the social cultural process of human individuals' formation is not a process of adaptation, but a process of appropriation. And Leontyev explains the difference. The fundamental difference between the process of adaptation, in the proper sense of the term, and the process of appropriation and mastery is that the process of biological adaptation is one of change of the organism's species characteristics and capabilities and its species behavior, whereas the process of appropriation or mastering is one that results in the individual's reproduction of historically formed human capacities and functions. That, it can be said, is the process by which human individual achieves in ontogenetic development what is achieved in animals through heredity. That is the embodiment of the advances of species evolution in the characteristics of the individual. Let's explain a little that. For all animal species, the formation of the development of the individual, that means the ontogenetic development, is a process by which the individual, the organism, adapt to the environment the characteristics of the species. That characteristics are transmitted to each individual of that species by the heredity, the genetic heredity. And the difference for us human beings is that by that biological transmission of genetic heredity, we just receive when we were born, we just receive the biological characteristics of human beings, not the historical and cultural. But we, human beings, we are essentially historical and cultural. And that is the difference. That's why we need the process of appropriation by which each individual reproduces the human capacities, human characteristics, or in the Marx words, the essential powers of the humankind. Well, Leontyev explains the three most important characteristics of the appropriation of the cultural by the individuals. Firstly, the appropriation is an active process. The individual must to perform a practical and or cognitive activity which has to be adequate to the social meaning of the cultural object. It is the same to say that the individual has to reproduce the social activity objectified in the social function of that object. Of course, the level of adequacy of the individual's activity to the social meaning of the cultural object can be lower or higher, depending on the concrete situation and the specific moment in which the appropriation occurs. The most common is the appropriation process occurs as a spiral in which the individual passes through different levels of mastering of the cultural object. That is one of the reasons of the importance of time and repetition in educational process. Well, the second characteristic of the appropriation process is that it is a process of reproduction. The appropriation has to reproduce in the individual the human powers historically produced. Here it is necessary to point out the positive sense in which Leontyev uses the concept of reproduction. In educational fields, there is nowadays in my opinion, unilateral association between the word reproduction and a negative value. But before to consider a reproductive process as something negative or positive, we have to understand what is being reproducing. The reproduction of human culture is an essential process without which there isn't human life. The educative process has to be reproductive. The fact that we valorize positively an educative process by which is developed autonomy and creativity doesn't mean that we are against all kind of reproductive educational process. For example, when a child learns to speak, that is essentially a process of reproduction of a specific language. The third characteristic of the process of appropriation is that it is a mediated process. At the process of the appropriation, the individual doesn't discover by itself in a lonely activity the social objective meaning of cultural objects. The individual learns that meaning with other individuals, acting with them. That means appropriation is an educative process, which can be direct or indirect, intentional or non-intentional, practical or theoretical. Schooling is a specific form of appropriation of knowledge by the individuals. Since my doctoral dissertation concluded at 1992, I have been working on articulation between activity theory and the theory of everyday life elaborated by Agnes Heller at the later 60s. Based on that articulation, I have been defining schooling as a mediation between the production and reproduction of cultural and everyday activities and the production and reproduction of the cultural at non-everyday activities as science, art, and philosophy. Well, I have no time to work more detailed that articulation with Agnes Heller's theory about everyday life and activity theory, but I emphasize that it's very rich articulation in my opinion. There are some very strong points of approaching between those two theories. The idea of appropriation as a mediated process, as an educative process, is connected with the concept, the famous concept of zone of proximal development in Vygotsky's book, Thinking and Speech. This is the title of that book in the collected works of Vygotsky in English. The collected works are published in 6 volumes, and that book received that title in that translation. There is another most famous translation in English of that book titled Thought and Language. It was published by MIT publisher. But that edition is a very bad edition. It isn't just a question about a bad translation. No. The problem is when the translators produced that edition in the beginning of the 60s. They cut a lot of parts of the original text. Actually, they cut about 60% of the original text, 60%. And not casually, they tried to change the Vygotsky's style, mainly in the parts of the text in which Vygotsky developed a criticism of others psychological theories. For example, in the second chapter, Vygotsky analyzed the two books of Piaget, and Vygotsky formulated, in my opinion, a very rich criticism of the Piagetian theory in that time. But the translators considered that maybe this chapter was not really good, and they produced a kind of digest of that chapter, and they considered that it was better for American readers. This is this is not a secret information. You can read that in the preface of that edition. They don't made secret of that. It was not a hidden work. No, but I don't know. People normally don't consider this a serious problem. I consider this a very serious problem. If you want to read Vygotsky, please read from the collected works and read the complete text. Well, in that book, Vygotsky, at the chapter 6, explains that every child, every human individual, has in every moment of its life two levels of development. The first one is the actual level of development, and it is defined by the tasks that the child can solve independently without any help or any kind of instruction. The second level is the zone of proximal development, and it is defined by the tasks that the child can't solve by itself independently, but can solve by imitation, by learning from other persons. To Vygotsky, what is in the present moment the level of actual development was in the past the zone of proximal development, which means that the psychological capacities of human individuals appears at the first time in an external form, as relations between human beings. Just in a second moment, those capacities turns internal to the individual mind. To Vygotsky, the only good education is the one that works with the zone of proximal development of the child. And there is here a very good passage from Vygotsky. He wrote, "When we observe the child's development and instruction in school, it becomes apparent that each subject demands more than the child is capable of, leading the child to carry out activities that force him to rise above himself. This is always the case with health school instruction. The child begins to learn to write when he does not yet have the mental functions that are required for written speech. It is for precisely this reason that instruction in written speech calls these functions to life and leads their development. This is true for all productive instruction. The incompetent child in a group of competent children will be delayed in his development and in the relative success of his mental activity. So will be the competent child in a group of incompetent children. For one of these children, the problem lies in the fact that instruction is too much difficult. For the other, in the fact that it's too easy. These opposing conditions lead to the same result. In both cases, instructions occurs outside the zone of proximal development, below in one case and above in the other. It is as fruitless to teach the child what he is not able to learn as it is to teach him what he can already do independently. I understand that Vygotskian psychology and Leontyev's psychology too is compatible with that Saviani's formulation on the task of a historical critical pedagogy in what refers to school education, that quotation by which I started my presentation. Marx and Vygotsky not only defended the idea that knowledge is objective, that it reflects the objectively existing reality, but also defended that there exists a process of development of knowledge, and this results in the existence of some most developed forms of knowledge. For both Marx and Vygotsky, the most developed forms must be starting points for understanding the least developed ones. Demirval-Saviani's pedagogical conception, as well as Vygotsky's psychology, are founded in Marx's dialectical method, within whose limits there is no margin for naive evolutionism, either on the plane of history of human social organization or on the plane of knowledge, or for the relativism of certain most developed forms of social life and of knowledge, or even for subjectivism that denies knowledge as the appropriation of objective reality by thought. In the postmodern atmosphere that prevails in our university all around the world, it is a very polemic idea nowadays that some kinds of knowledge are more developed than others. If such an idea is already polemic referring to scientific knowledge, it will be for sure much more polemic referring to art. It is a great heresy to postmodern ears to say that an artistic work is more developed than another. However, on his book Psychology of the Art, Vygotsky adopted the idea that the well-developed forms of art provide the key to the underdeveloped ones, just as the anatomy of man provides of human being provides the key to the anatomy of the ape. I assume that Vygotsky wrote that I assume that Shakespeare's tragedy explains the enigmas of primitive art and not the other way around. Vygotsky chose to analyze Shakespeare's Hamlet not as a personal preference, but for considering that tragedy one of the most developed forms of art. Vygotsky understood that psychology could find the explanatory laws of the individual's reactions to the art in general, and the way to do that would be studying exactly the most developed forms of art. That's, in my opinion, the key to a pedagogy inspired by activity theory. From that perspective, the mission of school education should to lead the new generations to appropriation of the most developed ways of the human knowledge in the fields of the science, philosophy, and art. And in order to conclude, that process of appropriation inside the school educational process, the process of appropriation of the most developed forms of knowledge of human culture is, in my understanding, in my interpretation, a reproductive process, but not in a negative sense, a negative meaning, but in a positive one. That means that by the school education, by the schooling, individuals are able to reproduce what the most rich has been produced by the humankind in the social and historical activities. Thank you.
Okay, floor is open.